Hi, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes, but we still have people filing in, and we definitely want to give them a chance to come in. This gives you the opportunity, if you need to use the restroom, it is around that wall right there. Men's right there, women's down the hall just a little farther. We also have refreshments out there. You can help yourself too, and we'll get started here in about 7 minutes or so. Good evening, everybody. If we could find our seats. I want to welcome everybody for coming out tonight to the Prop 1 Ranked Choice Voting Panel discussion. And as I look around the audience, I see that we've got a mixed group, and this is fantastic. And I want to welcome you guys and thank you guys for coming out, because this is, you know, you guys have all had barbecues where you invite a bunch of people, and this is Idaho, so if you give the RSVP, nobody wants to RSVP. You guys just showed up. You've given the invitation, showed up, so God bless you, and thank you guys for coming out. And I'd also like to thank Regeneration Calvary Chapel for opening their church to house this event. That's a really cool thing. A bit of housekeeping before we get underway. So I did say earlier, but we have some new people that have come in. If you're looking for the restroom, you go around that wall there, and the men's is the first one you come to, and then go down a little farther, there's the ladies' restroom. We do have drinks and stuff out in the lobby, and we ask if you grab a coffee or something, there should be lids around there. Grab a lid, put it on there, you know, protect the carpet. Yeah, so also if you could silence your cell phones just so that there are the least amount of interruptions. And I want you guys to know, I do want you guys to applaud. If there's something that is spoken and you guys like it and appreciate it, definitely applaud for that. That is very cool. But I don't want to have any booing or outbursts. No, like save that, or you don't even have to save it. Just take it to the ballot box and boo at the ballot box when you go. And, you know, something we have to do, some people say every 4 years you should be voting more often, obviously, right? And just one thing for the panelists, this is a live stream. We're doing a live stream, so no cussing, swearing, profane language. And I'm going to extend that also to the pastor and to the audience. Let's keep the language clean. And what else do I have here? Yeah, I want to keep it clean. This is, you know, of course, for the live stream, we don't want to get, what do they call that? YouTube jail or whatever they call it. I don't want that. But this is also a house of worship. So given that, I will bring up the panelists here in just a moment, but I'd like Pastor Jason, we asked him to come up and share some words before we get started. And he's around here somewhere. There he is. Hi, Pastor Jason. He doesn't have the mic yet, so I can say whatever I like. All right. I'm intimidated. I'm out of here.
Good evening. Welcome to Regeneration Calvary Chapel. And one of the things that, well, first let me pray. Father, we come to you right now, and we ask that you would just show us, Lord, that you would give us wisdom in our voting. Lord, give us wisdom into Prop 1. And Lord, we pray that truth would be spoken. And Lord, we know that there are two sides to the coin. And so we just pray that your truth would prevail. And so we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So one of the things that's been on my heart, even going into this Sunday, being the Sunday before the election, is truth. And that truth would prevail. As humans, we are designed to be investigators and to desire what is truth. And one of the things that our founding fathers understood was that, and they understood actually absolute truth. And the idea is that our founding fathers built the nation on principles of absolute truth. Because if the goalpost moves, then there is a problem that if truth is constantly moving, then it's not truth. And many of the founding fathers understood truth to be found in the Bible and essential to the well-being of a society that stays in order. John Adams, he said, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by mortality and religion. Our Constitution," that's our Constitution, "was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And so John Adams understood and recognized the foundation in moral and biblical truth was essential for stability and peace, which we're all in the pursuit of peace of some sort. And so there's an unchanging nature to truth. And that unchanging nature needs to be defined. In the church, we define it by God's absolute truth. But the definition of truth is absolute. Even though as a Christian, we find absolute truth in the Word. And so if it changes, if truth is constantly changing, then there is no longer truth. And God declares in the scriptures, Malachi 3:6, "For I am the Lord, I do not change." So if he is unchanging, if he is unwavering, just as our founding fathers built this nation with the belief in unchanging principles, that the principles of the Constitution would not change. God's nature and his word are consistent and unchanging, and his truth is a secure foundation. And that is the success of the United States, is that we have a foundation. Imagine if fundamental principles like freedom and justice were constantly redefined. They would lose their meaning. A society would collapse and there'd be chaos. And this truth applies spiritually. When we move away from biblical truth, we enter into moral and spiritual confusion, lacking a solid foundation. And when we lose our foundation, we feel like we're walking in unstable ways. And Jesus declared himself as truth. In John 14:6, Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And so this claim that Jesus made needs to be considered because he claimed it as an absolute truth. So one, whether you believe in Jesus or not, I appeal to you to do your investigation and consider his claim. Because when people abandon fundamental truth, confusion and chaos will follow. People lose sight of the ultimate standard. There needs to be a higher standard. There needs to be an ultimate standard. That is why the United States is so coveted. Thomas Jefferson once warned, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." So Jefferson recognized without God's truth, there would be consequence. And similarly, when we depart from biblical truth, we face spiritual consequences. Societies break. Mental disorders manifest. Suicide goes up. And tragically, without eternal hope, there's separation from God. And so the result of wavering from biblical truth, as the founding fathers had established, the Bible illustrates the danger of turning away from God's truth. There was a time when the children of Israel did not have a king. In Judges 21:25, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So when there is no commitment to absolute truth, people start creating their own truth, leading to moral relativism and confusion. And so this principle applies to our lives today. Without fundamental truth, without religious truth, and as a Christian, without Jesus being the foundation, societies and individuals fall into chaos. James Madison wrote, "We have staked the whole future of America's civilization upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God." This is why the Constitution has worked. Our founding fathers believed that turning from God's law would lead in societal decay. And likewise, in our personal lives, abandoning God's truth leads to personal instability and brokenness. But yet there's good news. Jesus made a way, an unchanging foundation for salvation. God's truth doesn't only convict us of sin, but it provides a way of salvation, to be saved. Jesus came to set us free from chaos and confusion that sin causes. And sin is simply those things that we do that we know that we shouldn't do. Anything that would violate the top 10. Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So he remains an unchanging foundation. And so we can rely on his redemption. We could rely on the peace that he gives. And we need to look at what Jesus said in John 3:16. And I'm sure many of you know this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And so this verse shows the unchanging love and commitment that God has to demonstrate his love as he sent his only Son to bear the punishment for all of our wrongdoing by providing a way to escape chaos and confusion. You see, Jesus declared himself as absolute truth. And if the founding fathers were awake today, if they were alive today, they would petition to you to return to an absolute truth. They had a dependence and a reliance upon biblical truths for a just society. Our nation needs to return to biblical values as an unchanging foundation of our lives. It doesn't say you have to believe everything that the Bible says. But my appeal as a pastor is come to Jesus. But my appeal as a civilian is let's set the bar for values. And the founding fathers set the values and the foundation based on biblical values, the top 10. And so Jesus offers not only forgiveness, but stability and absolute truth. Psalm 119, 160 says, the entirety of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous judgments endures forever. So this means we do not have to live in confusion or chaos by moral uncertainties. Jesus invites us to embrace him as an unchanging truth, as a savior, as a foundation for all of our lives. And so in conclusion, the beauty of our Constitution is that you and I have the freedom to choose what we want to believe. You and I, you have the freedom to disagree with me. You have the freedom to think that I'm crazy. And I have the freedom to think you're crazy for not believing. And if we're not careful in our vote, you can lose that freedom to believe what you want. If we're not careful with our vote, we can lose the freedom to disagree. And so based on my anchored truth of absolute truth, which I believe is the Bible, the creator of all things, the authority of all things, invites you to have a relationship with him in and through his Son, Jesus Christ. And our American founding fathers relied on this unchanging truth to build a stable society. They understood that the nation that has no fear of a creator is a nation that won't last. We must report to somebody higher than ourselves. And if you exercise your freedom and choose Jesus to be your Lord and Savior, I promise you, you will have peace in the place of chaos and stability in the place of uncertainty, regardless of the outcome of the election. Freedom, peace, comfort, stability is found in God, is found in Christ. The Bible tells us, whom the Son sets free is free indeed. And we have been celebrating freedom, but there in the UK, people are being arrested simply for praying in their heads quietly. And if we're not careful with our vote, you may not have the freedom to think what you want. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that your word says it does not return to yourself without accomplishing what you sent it out to do. And so, Lord, I pray for a blessing upon tonight. I pray for integrity for the panel. We pray that you would just rid any confusion. Lord, that you give clarity on this Proposition 1, and Lord, why we are here. And so we just thank you for what you're going to do. We thank you for the freedom to come in assembly, Lord, to have this debate. And Lord, let us be good stewards of this freedom. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Jason. All right, I'd like to invite the panelists to the stage. You guys know who you are. Come on up. We even have water here. So if we get some bread, this will be a proper prison. I will bring the corny jokes, guys. I am sorry. All right. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming out tonight. They did not have to come out, but they did choose to. On the 4 Pro 1 side here, we have Luke Mayville from Reclaim Idaho. We have Christy Wood from Veterans for Idaho Voters. And on the against Prop 1 side, we have Michael Angeletta. And State Senator Scott Herndon. So, again, just to reiterate, the goal here tonight is truth. That's really what we want. We want to hear both sides. And everybody here, I assume, has read through Prop 1, if you haven't already voted. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to have each panelist, they're going to speak for 5 minutes on why they are here. And I'd like to start with Luke, if we could, from Reclaim Idaho. And you need a microphone. This isn't going to get very far without microphones. There we are.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. The pastor a moment ago talked about these fundamental truths, these principles put forward by our founding fathers. Here's one of those. Government should always be accountable to the people, right? And put forward in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson originally, this basic idea that government must always be based upon the consent of the governed. That basic, and those two ideas are really one and the same, that government must be based upon the consent of the governed. That means that those who make our laws should always be accountable to those who have to live under the laws. By that standard, we have a very serious problem in Idaho. Because right now, because we have closed primary elections, it means that elected officials are commonly elected, elevated to office, with the votes of 9, 10, 11% of the voting population. A lieutenant governor a few years ago was elected in a closed primary election with just over 6% of the total voters in Idaho. And that's because, as is so often the case, our elected officials are elected in closed primaries that are tightly restricted where if you are an independent voter, you are blocked from participating. The only way that you can participate is if you join a political party that you don't believe in and you don't belong to. And then what happens is elected officials are elected in these low turnout primaries where the vast majority of people in Idaho don't vote in those primaries. Many of them can't. And they go on to the general election in November, and in the general election they sail through because we live in a state dominated by one party. So we end up with elected officials who are not accountable to the people of the state. They're accountable to about 9% of the people of the state. That's not government based on the consent of the governed. That's not living up to one of the fundamental truths put forward by our founding fathers. So I'll just quickly say Proposition 1 changes that. Proposition 1 takes on the problem of the closed primary directly in two basic ways. The first thing is that it creates an open, nonpartisan primary where all voters, regardless of party affiliation, are free to participate. The second way is by giving us general elections in November. Imagine this, because you haven't seen this in Idaho for 30 years. General elections in November that are actually competitive, where you don't know where you don't know beforehand who's going to win, and where there's a variety of candidates on the ballot, including multiple candidates from the majority party, from the Republican Party. So when you show up to vote, you don't know who's going to win, and guess what? That means that your vote could actually make a difference, and that government might actually be accountable to you, even if you didn't vote in the closed primary. And the way we get there in the general election is we have the top 4 candidates from the primary go forward to the general election. And then to make sure that they're not splitting the vote 4 ways and giving us a winner who only has 26% of the vote, we've got ranked choice voting. And we can talk more about the specifics of ranked choice voting. Thanks for the clock back there, because I know I have 47 seconds left. But we can talk more about the specifics of ranked choice voting, but the basic principle underlying ranked choice voting is that it guarantees that the winner of the election has broad support from the public. So you can see how the open primary frees up all of the voters to participate, including Idaho's 270,000 independents. And then ranked choice voting in the general guarantees that the winner in November has broad support from the public. And both these things taken together really do allow us to live up to that basic principle that government should always be accountable to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. If you could pass it over to Michael Angeletta. I didn't introduce him properly. He's from Secure Idaho Elections, and he will give his 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for calling my attention to the timer. Proposition 1 proponents may argue that it's good for Idaho, but it's important to consider the context of trust in institutions nationwide. If you look at your blue handout that we put on your chairs, you'll see that this republic's in crisis and that most of the institutions in this country suffer from very low trust. For example, the US federal government and election system, it's rating at about 20% confidence level right now. Now, if we come to Idaho, we actually have a fairly high trust election system where approximately 2/3 of Idahoans believe in the integrity of the election process here in Idaho. It's a gem. And I think we can all agree that that trust is something we all want to protect. So when we're looking at Prop 1, is it good, is it bad for Idahoans, we really have to ask 2 critical questions. First, does Proposition 1 enhance or does it damage the trust in Idaho's election process? And the second question we have to answer for ourselves is, does Proposition 1 represent the will of most Idahoans, most, which, by the way, self-identify as conservative, or does it represent outside financial interests? So I'll leave you with those 2 questions as I proceed. So I want to use the remainder of my 3 minutes and 40 seconds to address some of the claims by Proposition 1 that we're seeing in the big multi-million-dollar ad blitz, and I'm sure you've all seen the ads by now. in either direct mail or TV. The first is cost. So the Proposition 1 proponents will tell you it's a drop in the bucket. Our own Secretary of State, on the other hand, who's most intimate with our election system, will tell you it's going to cost $20 to $40 million for the state. Now the question is, nobody knows who's actually going to pay for that. And I haven't received an answer yet from any of the proponents. Hopefully we can explore that tonight. My fear is, speaking with county commissioners, that it's going to hit the county and their budgets, which means in a place like Kootenai County, where I'm from, that could be as low as $850,000, maybe as much as $3 million. Now, what does that mean for the commissioners? That means they have to hike property taxes to the max, still not enough. So that also means they have to take that money from elsewhere. It could even be essential services. So it's an open question on who is going to pay for it. Now, speaking of money, it's important we understand the funding of this campaign. And unfortunately, our side does not have the luxury of the funding that the Prop 1 proponents have. They've raised over $4.5 million from out-of-state millionaire, billionaire, dark money group interests. 80% of the funds for Prop 1 are coming from out of state. So I'll ask the question, do you think millionaires and billionaires from out of this state care about you, the average Idahoan voter? Okay? So let's speak more about money too. If you look at your yellow handout, this is the first open primary in Alaska. And you'll see about 48 candidates there. Now, to be fair, there were about 22 candidates in the open primary, the subsequent election in Alaska. And so the question is, how does a voter do adequate research and vetting of all of these candidates? So there's a lot of extra confusion now when you have this many candidates. So with all of that confusion in the landscape, how does a candidate on a list like this stand out? What do they have to do? They've got to spend a lot more money. And there's a growing body of academic research that shows, paradoxically, when you have more choice like this, infinite choice almost, that private big money interests fill the void and gain influence because they are able to help one of these candidates get to the top of this very confusing list that voters just can't make sense of. Proposition 1, they claim that it silences voters. And I'm interested in what Christy's going to have to say here. If you look at the green handout, the Veterans for Idaho Voters claims that veterans' voices are being silenced. And if you go to their website, it says half of veterans are identifying as independent or vote as independent. Look at that green handout. It's simply not true. It's not true. 29% of veterans are registered independent, while the vast majority of them identify either as Democrat or Republican leaning. So I'm going to challenge the Proposition 1 proponents to back up that 50% number that they're broadcasting everywhere. Finally, I'd say, look at what this might do to transparency in our election system. Ranked choice voting will take away the county clerk's ability to certify election results. Those tabulations ostensibly go to Boise, go to a machine with a ranked choice voting algorithm, and the county clerk does not certify that. And I've heard that firsthand from our county clerk right here. And so I ask the question again, what will this do to the trust in Idaho's election system? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we're going to have Christy Wood speak from Veterans for Idaho Voters. And I want to remind the audience, whether you're for or against, I don't want to have outbursts because I don't want to stop any of the talkers right in the middle, the panelists, while they're speaking. So let's limit the outbursts. I know we get energetic in that, but let's hear this information. And if they say something you like, we'll have a moment to clap, but the outbursts have to minimize. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate being able to be here tonight with all of you. And I appreciate the words of the pastor as well. It's so important that as a community, we have these kind of dialogues where we can agree to disagree or we put our information out there. Veterans for Idaho Voters is a really great organization. I'm proud to be a member of them. It's cross-partisan. Every branch of military is represented. And our focus is really on, well, certainly supporting the open primary, but our focus is on that veterans, independent veterans, are able to vote in the open primary. I appreciate the lead-in by Mr. Angeletta of challenging my stats. I'm not familiar with any voter registration that says leaning Republican. I'm just not familiar with that. It's either Republican, Democrat, or independent. So our stats are that there's 160,000 military veterans in Idaho. That's the 6th highest in the United States, because who wouldn't want to live in Idaho? It's great here. Roughly half of those military veterans are independents. Now, veterans tend to be independents because we knew when we served that we fought on behalf of the freedoms of all Americans, not just some. Thank you. And so a vast majority prefer to be independents. They just want that ability to pick and choose on their ballot. Now, the opponents of Prop 1 will tell you, veterans, all you have to do is affiliate as a Republican, and then you can vote. Well, what kind of freedom is that exactly? Is that the freedom that our veterans fought for? I don't think so. So they also tell you that we don't want any Republican name only, rhinos, signing up to vote in our primary. I think you have to pick one. I think you have to pick one of those arguments to have a sane conversation about it. And I'll tell you what the veterans pick. They pick an open primary where all of our freedoms are honored to vote. Thank you. Now I'll tell you a little about who we are. Our honorary chairman is our former governor, Butch Otter. Some of our members are former legislators, both sides of the aisle. We've got Marv Hagedorn, Larry LaRocco. Our president is Todd Achilles, that was just appointed this year by Governor Little. And it's just this incredible group of people. Many of you have probably read the writings of Jim Jones, our former Attorney General. He's one of our leaders. We really enjoy Jim. But the other members, I would encourage you to go on our website and look at these members. And one of them's here tonight, my friend Gray Henderson, served in Vietnam. Those are the veterans that you're going to see, the everyday heroes, the patriots out there that fought on behalf of this country. And their expectation is they should be allowed to vote in any election they want to. I tend to agree with them. I know we'll get deeper into these conversations, and I look forward to it. I appreciate all the people up here, and it's going to be a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy. And lastly, we'll have Scott Herndon. I had to look at the paper. I'm just kidding. Scott Herndon will be speaking for his 5 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I want to start out just by correcting what I think is misinformation around the Proposition 1 campaign. So I just heard Luke say that in the closed primary elections, 9 to 11% of the voting population have been participating. And I want to address that. In Bonner County, in the last 2 May primary elections, if you look at Democratic primary, unaffiliated voters, and Republican primary, we're pushing almost 50% turnout in our elections. Statewide, ever since we closed the Republican primary, the turnout has actually gone up since when it was an open primary election. Now, he also said that it is very difficult to vote in a closed primary. He said it was tightly restricted and closed. So here's the interesting thing. According to Idaho law, 100% of the voters in Idaho can vote in the primary election in May. 100%. And here's how difficult and tightly restricted it is. To vote in the only primary election that technically is, quote, closed, the Republican primary election, when you register to vote, which could be on election day, and if you're unaffiliated, these 275,000 unaffiliated voters, 6,000 in Bonner County, you can actually vote in the Republican primary election by showing up on election day and saying your affiliation is Republican. That is how difficult it is to vote in the Republican primary election. Some people will say, well, you have to join the party. There's no membership fees. There's no monthly meetings. You have to do nothing but check a box. And in fact, it's so easy, you can go to voteidaho.gov and you can check the box online when you register to vote. That's how easy it is to participate in Idaho's elections. If we were going to discount the results of elections, the ones we should discount the most then would be the bond and levy elections, which have the lowest voter turnout. Proposition 1 is not going to fix low voter turnout. What fixes low voter turnout is great candidates and great ideas, and getting the message out to people to participate in this Republican form of government that we have. Proposition 1 is not going to change that. What's actually going to change if Proposition 1 passes is exactly what Michael alluded to. In 2004, I was a brand new Idaho voter, and I voted for Michael Perutka, Constitution Party candidate for President of the United States of America. And I used to only think of politics in terms of federal elections, and then along about 2012, I got disillusioned because Washington was very far away, and I had almost zero impact. In 2016, as a registered voter in Idaho, I was a registered Republican at that time, and I ran a ballot initiative, just like Proposition 1 is today. And in 8 short years, between the time that I ran a ballot initiative as a citizen, I got involved in the Republican Party, and I became the county chair of the Bonner County Republican Party. I'm on the state Republican Party Executive Committee, and I'm a state senator. That's how easy it is through the political party process to have an impact. Before I was ever in the legislature, I was able to bring bills to legislators and actually get some bills passed into law, and I wasn't special. Anybody through the political party process can participate. But what will happen after Proposition 1 is what we see right now. We see Article 4 as an organization out of Alexandria, Virginia, which has put $2.2 million into this effort. A brand new corporation started in 2021 near Washington, D.C. has decided they want to invest millions of dollars in Proposition 1 in Idaho. Is it because they care about Idahoans and what happens in Idaho government? Or is it because they have climate agenda interests and other political interests that they know they can only buy with millions of dollars if Proposition 1 passes? That's the goal. The value of political parties is that people join together to pick their nominees. And that's the other thing I want to call out here. Nobody is elected to government office at a primary election. Party nominees are chosen, but the value of those parties is that people come together and they work in unison to attain a goal. No man can accomplish anything as an island. We all know, all men and women, that we join together to pursue our common ideologies and ideas, and we will lose that ability in Proposition 1, and big corporate interests will control Idaho if Proposition 1 passes.
We want to get through as many questions as possible. So, and thank you again, panel, for taking the time to do this. This crowd's about to beat you guys up a little bit. So I just want you guys to raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone over to you. You ask your question. I'm going to take a question from this side. You guys are going to see me going back and forth. It's going to be a real feat for me to keep up with you. But I'm going to go over this way. I see a hand fly up first. And these questions can be answered by any of the panel members, anybody that wants to speak on it. Take about 2 minutes to speak about it each, if you care to. And you got to hold that real close.
Okay. I'm not really a prepared speaker. I'm an independent, and I'm proud of it. I've been in Idaho since I was 5 years old, and I'm 50-something. I don't appreciate my tax dollars being used in primary elections that don't have anybody I care about. I work for the county. I see how the process works. I see that I'm closed out, and my opinion doesn't seem to matter. I don't want to be part of a party. I don't really like the idea. And I find it abhorrent that I have to say what I am to some government agency. I live in Idaho. I want to be independent and on my own. So my question to the board is, why are you forcing me to choose something just so I can have a voice?
All right, any of you up there can take on the question first, and anybody that wants to speak to it?
Okay, well, I'll start since I have the microphone. Number one, on the question of, I agree, we're using taxpayer money to fund primary elections in May. That's because there's also a lot of things on your ballot that actually are not partisan. So at our recent primary election ballot, we're voting on judges. Those are not partisan. So that's the reason the government has an interest in that particular election. I will say that all of us are funding things with our taxes that we do not partake of. So, for example, if you choose not to check your affiliation as Republican, so you don't vote in the Republican primary and you vote in a different party's primary, then that is a choice you made. But then again, Medicaid expansion passed by ballot initiative, and it is going to cost $1 billion this year in Idaho alone. And a lot of us in this room, me included in my family, don't participate in Medicaid. Public education is going to cost Idaho $3.5 billion this year. And for 20 years, I've raised 8 kids, and my family doesn't participate in public education. So that's just the nature of the system. We have a little commission on Hispanic affairs, and unless you're Hispanic, you're not benefiting from that $500,000 in taxpayer funding. It's sort of the nature of when we come together collectively in government that our taxes are paying for things that not all of us are directly benefiting from, but we as a society believe that we are overall benefiting from those things being paid for. But again, I really don't think it's, if we want other parties, if we want better candidates, if we want better parties, that requires better ideas. That requires better candidates. It doesn't require Proposition 1. For example, if the Democratic Party wants to be competitive in the state of Idaho, they have to have better ideas that appeal to more voters, and they will be competitive. The Republican Party, why are we the dominant party? As Luke mentioned, we're the main party in the state. Why? Probably because the Republican Party ideas are better. But that doesn't leave everybody else out from organizing around great ideas and great candidates.
I just add, if you look at the origin of political primaries in the first place, it was precisely 4 parties, which are freely associated, voluntarily associated citizens who share common interests, beliefs, and values, to form a party and nominate their candidate. That was the initial intent. Before, there were fat cats and smoky back rooms making deals and buying candidates. The whole point of a political primary was to open that up democratically for political membership. And what happens is when you do get rid of that party vetting, you look in Alaska, for instance, and there's a convicted felon on the ballot. And that's precisely because you're missing that vetting of the political primaries. Look it up, it's true. The Democratic Party is trying to sue to get him removed. I don't know what the latest update is. So that vetting of sharing similar principles and values is absolutely important when it comes to a political primary.
Look, I just want to say, Scott, we agree on this idea that it's a very good thing to organize around good ideas. And I feel that's what personally, I've been trying to do that for years in Idaho. And well, we could have a debate sometime separately about Medicaid expansion. I think the recent polling shows that it's still supported by over 60% of the population. And that was a big idea, good idea that we organized around, right? Look, I want to speak to Eldon's comment. No tax-paying citizen should be forced to, pay taxes for an election that they can't participate in. That's not good. And I do think at the heart of your question is this dispute that we have that Scott spoke to earlier, that maybe it really isn't hard for independents to participate in the current closed primary. And you might say, and we could have a reasonable debate about that, yeah, okay, you just, as an unaffiliated voter, you can show up on the day of the election, join the Republican Party, and then vote in the Republican primary, and then you can unaffiliate back afterwards. And if you are of that view that that's no big deal, then fine, maybe you're not in favor of Proposition 1. But many, many people, I will tell you, from talking to thousands of people all over the state, many people will tell you that they refuse to join a party they don't believe in and don't belong to, and that they don't believe they should be forced to join a party even for a day, even for an hour, just to exercise their right to vote. They should be able to remain independent and still be able to vote. And again, you could say, again, as Scott mentioned, I believe, that after all, they still have their right to vote because the primary isn't an election, really. The primary doesn't choose who eventually wins. All it does is nominate candidates. But do any of us, and I know people will probably scream out yes when I say this, but
we're going into overtime right there.
Deep down, do you really believe that when general elections are never competitive, and we all know that primaries are where our candidates are really chosen, right?
Eldon, the Veterans Organization agrees with you. It is not just your veterans that have already served this country. It's your active duty personnel, your daughters, your sons, your dad, your mom. They're stationed all over the world, but they're from Idaho, and they're paying taxes in Idaho, and they're protecting your freedoms. And there isn't anyone that's going to convince me that it's right, that they shouldn't be able to show up and vote in a primary as the independent that they want to be.
And we'll take a question from that side of the room over there. Hand raise, anybody? Oh, got one over there. Where was that hand raise? Right here.
Hi, to me the bigger issue is not the open primaries, it's the ranked choice voting. And my understanding is that the person with the most votes is not necessarily the one that's going to win. And so I guess I would like you each to explain how ranked choice voting really benefits us, the voters, when the person with the most votes doesn't win necessarily.
It is, in fact, the case.
I should say the person, when we vote, one person, when we do check the box and we vote, not the whole recounting. That's a whole nother, that changes the vote.
It is, in fact, the case that in a ranked choice election, the person with the most votes wins. The person with the most votes always wins in a ranked choice election. There's actually a quote in Proposition 1 that says, I believe, verbatim, the candidate with the most votes wins. And the way that works is that the very first thing that happens is all the first choices on the ballot are counted. Then and there, if anyone gets up over 50%, they're declared the winner. And that's what happens the vast majority of the time. So most of the time, it's just a very simple counting process where they count the first choices on the ballots. If someone gets over 50%, they're declared the winner. But if no one gets over 50%, if whoever came in first in that very first round, say only had 30%, you've got to go to a second round. And what happens there is actually very simple. There's a lot of talk about how it's some mysterious algorithm. One of the legislators in Boise a couple months ago called it a logarithm, which is kind of weird. But here's all it is. All that happens is whoever comes in last place gets eliminated. And if that was your favorite candidate, your first choice, your vote goes to your second choice. Again, candidate with that came in last place gets eliminated. If that was your favorite candidate, your vote goes to your second choice. That's the whole process. And that process repeats, then the third place candidate gets eliminated, and so on. As soon as someone gets over 50%, they're declared the winner. That was the candidate with the most votes, with the most support in the election. Because again, we want elected leaders who represent the broader community, not just one narrow group of voters who participate in a closed primary. We want candidates who represent all of us.
Unfortunately, empirically, it doesn't bear out that the broader community is represented in ranked choice voting. The academic literature is completely a mixed bag. There is no definitive evidence that it represents the broader swath of people at all. My bigger concern with ranked choice voting is oftentimes you get a winner who isn't the winner of a true majority. And that's oftentimes a claim I hear from Proposition 1 proponents. And the reason is as you do successive rounds of tabulation with RCV, you're losing people's ballots. They're getting tossed or they're getting exhausted. And they're all different. Oh, I'm very interested in Luke's shaking his head. I'm very interested to hear how that's not true. So an exhausted vote is somebody who, for instance, will vote on principle for one candidate, and that candidate doesn't win in that first round, and they don't have any second or third or fourth ranks, so that ballot and that voice ends up being exhausted. However, there's many other reasons why people's ballots end up getting what's called spoiled. So they'll keep talking about, you don't have to rank all of those people, including the ones you detest. Well, that's technically true. You do run the risk of your ballot being exhausted, however, but there's something more insidious with ranked choice voting, and that's spoiled ballots. And so the academic literature shows that ballot error rate increases tenfold. That's 1,000%. And I'll give you an example. In the handouts there's a white-colored handout. And what you're holding is a real-world ballot from a Santa Fe mayoral race that was spoiled. That's somebody that went to the ballot box in Santa Fe, they went home, they told their family they did their civic duty, and they went to bed at night not knowing that their voice was silenced and not heard. That was a 650% increase in spoiled ballots in one mayoral election. And you see that across the board. And it has a disparate impact on seniors, on new voters, and also on low income, in this case, Hispanic community. So when we're talking about disenfranchising and silencing voters, we really ought to also consider the voices that are being silenced with this increased exponential complexity of ranked choice voting.
Thank you. You know, we keep being told that it's just so complicated, that none of us are smart enough to figure this out. Counting to 4, it's not that tough. And I'm not just speaking for veterans, I'm speaking for all of you. I think you can do it. Luke gives some really great statistics around ranked choice voting, and he has been able to debunk a lot of the things that we hear from the opponents. But I will tell you that I'm not afraid of having the ability to basically do a runoff. I get to go in to the ballot box and I get to choose my top one. If my top person doesn't prevail overall, I'm still in it. I still have a voice. I appreciate that.
I got one over there. No, back.
Okay, I want to address the question of whether ranked choice voting assures that the candidate who wins actually has broad support. And there's actually no guarantee of that, because by the time you get to the last instant runoff round, if you had 100,000 voters showed up on election day, you can win the last round with a majority of the last round, which could be less than 50,001 voters. In other words, less than a true majority of the people who showed up that day. And also, do they represent broad support? Keep in mind that voter turnout at that election is probably not going to be 100% of registered voters, and not everybody who's eligible to vote is even a registered voter. So ranked choice voting doesn't guarantee that a candidate has broad support. So that's just simply not true. What ranked choice voting does is it does two things that puts Idaho elections in jeopardy in my mind, and also defies human behavior. So once round one happens, if a candidate doesn't get a majority, normally humans, now knowing which candidates dropped out and who's left, if we all got back in the room and we're going to make the decision again, now we have new information. And ranked choice voting denies our ability to include the new information before we vote on round two. We have to predict. It's like getting a cancer diagnosis, and you have to decide the 6 different stages of treatment, not knowing how stage 1 is going to turn out before you decide on stage 2. And if stage 1 turns out a certain way, you can't include that new information before you decide on stage 2. That defies human behavior. But it also means right now we have paper ballots in Bonner and Boundary County. They get counted locally. We know what the results are within hours. And now we're going to have to transmit ballots electronically, which is not done in these counties. And a federal government contractor just had 275 million American Social Security numbers hacked. That happens
We're
in
over
online
time there,
systems. So thank you.
All right, we got a question from this side.
So Idaho is a traditionally very conservative state, and my concern is the money that's coming in to fund this proposition is vast majority of it is dark money coming in from outside of our own state, which was mentioned before. I see that as being extremely nefarious, and I'm interested to know why you think it's a good or bad idea that liberals from outside of our state are funding this proposition and trying to insert or impose their will on our state when they don't live here and they don't pay our taxes and they don't share our values.
Okay, thank you for the question. Okay, so just really mostly in the last month, if you go to the Sunshine Reports at the Idaho Secretary of State, and you look at Idahoans for Open Primaries, which is a political action committee that's supporting Proposition 1, you'll see that there's over $5.5 million in donations to the campaign. Now, here's the interesting thing. The governor's race a couple of years ago didn't even come close to $5 million. $5.5 million. It's amazing for Idaho. Idaho is a cheap state. So what people with an agenda from Alexandria, Virginia, from Washington, D.C., from around the country, they're targeting 8 states this year. If I were to try to win something in Pennsylvania, I might have to put up $100 million, but I can buy Idaho for $5 million. Because all I got to do is get enough advertising in front of the lowest information voter to buy Idaho for $5 million. That is a serious concern. It's true, it happens. McDonald's and all the major corporations know this. Spend a lot of money on advertising, rinse and repeat, and you get customers. That's how it works. So when we talk about dark money, we have corporations like Article 4 and others, that 2 major corporations that were just formed in recent years that have stated their agenda is to pass ranked choice voting in these multiple states, starting with the cheaper states like Idaho. And we don't know, they get grants that we don't know who's behind all of those millions of dollars. Well, that will be the future of Idaho if Proposition 1 passes. There will be all kinds of money behind candidates from Alexandria, Virginia-based corporations pushing your favorite candidate like McDonald's pushes the Big Mac. And that is who is likely to win elections in the future. And I don't think Idaho wants that. I don't think that actually represents the broader opinion of Idahoans.
And speaking of another cheap state, sounds like a cheap date. I don't know. I don't like that. Is Alaska. And Alaskans, they brought RCV to Alaska a couple of years ago, and I think they outspent the opponents of ranked choice voting and open primaries by 10 or 20 to 1. Same thing. I think even more millions were poured into Alaska. Alaskans now have a repeal on the ballot, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that works out, by the way. Little tidbit, they call it open primaries. Definitionally, I would refer to it as jungle primaries. We don't have to nerd out on exactly what that definitional difference is. However, typically when you look across the country, when you look at jungle primaries, it's top 2 jungle primary. But here in Idaho, they made it top 4. Anybody know why they would have made it top 4? Well, I can tell you. The reason is, thank you for raising your hand. Rhetorical question. Thank you, though. When you have top 2 in Idaho, you're going to get 2 Republicans that are going to win the open primary and go on to the general election. When you have top 4, now you've got a chance to get a progressive onto that general election. And that's why we've got top 4. And that's why now we have to swallow the poison pill also of ranked choice voting. And I'd simply argue this: even if you're an independent and open primaries are appealing to you, I understand that as somebody who's lived half his life as an independent, who now is a registered Republican. Even if you accept that that is good, you still have to swallow that pill of ranked choice voting. Thank you.
Okay, I want to talk about how Proposition 1 is being funded, and I just want to carry out a little experiment here, and if some people in the audience will help me out. Could you raise your hand if you've donated in support of Proposition 1? Over 5,000 Idahoans, representing all 44 counties in the state, have donated to support Proposition 1. It is true that there are some national organizations, some pro-reform organizations And by the way, there are the board members of those organizations from both parties across the political spectrum, so it's just false to say they're liberal. They're all liberal organizations. It's true that they've supported this reform, and they've supported reforms around the country. And by the way, if you're completely against money from supporters of out of state coming in to support things, I hope you'll hold other campaigns to that same standard. I hope you I hope, for example, a couple months from now, in this next legislative session, when the big fight over school vouchers comes around, I hope you'll hold both sides of that debate to the same standard. But look, over 5,000 Idahoans representing all 44 counties, and these organizations from other states have started supporting this campaign really in large amounts only in the last couple months. Over 90% of the funding to get Prop 1 on the ballot came from supporters right here in Idaho, and the entire campaign was built by Idahoans, is driven by Idahoans, run by Idahoans from the very beginning. So there's some support coming from other states, but it cannot be denied that this is a homegrown effort and that it's really one of the largest grassroots effort in the history of our state.
Well, like Luke, I grew up in Idaho, and I'm not aware of a whole gaggle of liberals piling in. I haven't seen it. Idahoans are very independent people. They just always have been. Now, our veterans organization, we are funded exactly like the open primary campaign. Our veterans have kicked in. There's a national veterans group that has kicked in. We really haven't spent a lot of money. We've just been out trying to meet you one-on-one and help you understand why this issue is so near and dear to us. I don't buy into all this dark money is fueling this. These are Republicans. This is what's interesting. This is Republicans that many of you know that spurred on this proposition. So I'm not going to buy that argument that the 10 Democrats in Idaho are leading this. I don't think so.
All right, we got a question up front here. And hold it close.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting, some of the response that we've had about the funding, because I did a little research on that. And I would ask the panelists to address an interview that aired on YouTube on June 10th, 2024. And that interview was between the CEO of Fair Vote, headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, also like Alexandria, inside the Beltway. And the CEO's name was Meredith Sumter. And the interviewer was Andrew Yang. Many of you will be familiar with him. He was a Democratic, he ran for the Democratic nomination for president. And he is currently a board member of Fair Vote Action. Now, Fair Vote turns out to be a national partner of Unite America. And Luke, you'll be familiar with them because they donated $1.1 million to Idahoans for open primaries. And it was interesting, all of you that raised your hands, yes, I'm an Idahoan who donated. That one donation, which at the time I looked was about 25% of Idahoan for open primaries donations, amounts to more than all the donations from Idaho, just for some perspective. So I'm gonna quote the interview because I'd like you to address it. Andrew Yang opens by saying, if we are going to try, and this is verbatim, if we are going to try and unlock hundreds of billions of dollars in value, we should be investing at least $1 billion in ranked choice voting. Then he says, so any mega billionaires out there, feel free to cut Meredith, pointing at Meredith Sumter, president of, or CEO of Fair Vote, Meredith and the gang, a blank check, during which time Meredith is saying, please, please, please. This is the video, and you should all go look at this. Because it'll be the best money you ever spent. You're spending a lot of money on trying to address climate change, education, these other things. Election reform actually has a chance to make our government accountable and effective and representative and responsible, presumably to the billionaire donor audience which they were courting. And if our leaders don't deliver for us, presumably on those policy objectives they stated, guess what? They're out. To which Meredith Sumter responds, I mean, you're a math guy. I'm a markets person or a private sector person. It's all about what is the return on our investment here, right? She then proceeds to explain that the current political system is holding back progress, quote unquote, on certain sets of political goals, presumably those that she and Andrew support and are courting the billionaires for. And that donating to promote RCV is a more efficient way for donors to make that progress than investing in specific political campaigns. Now, that should be disturbing to us all, right? So, yeah, I'm asking them to respond, thank you. That should be disturbing to us all. So then the question would be, why would they make such statements? Luke, you yourself claimed in your opening statement that Idaho general ballots are likely to have multiple dominant party candidates. And there's your answer. It systematizes a vote split. That's what this does. One, the top 4 primary, incentivizes name recognition candidates, and then you split the dominant party vote. That's why your donors were saying what they were saying in this YouTube video. Would you please respond to that?
Oh, wow. Yeah. You sat down, but I think I saw you up in Sandpoint. And you know what? That was a long statement, but I'm glad you did it because we're here to hear all sides tonight. The question was somewhere in there, but I'll tell you, I don't use social media. I just don't, and I haven't watched it, so I'm not going to be able to really respond to you the way that you would like me to, but I think maybe Luke has a response.
I'm struggling a little bit to remember the question, but you did just ask to respond to the general statement, right? I'll tell you, the entire origin of the Idahoans for Open Primaries campaign and Proposition 1, it originally came around when one of our last big campaigns where we were trying to get more funding for public schools in Idaho came to a close. We traveled all over the state, and we took with us this little ballot box, and when we did events around the state, we had people put in a little slip of paper, what should be the next big issue. And by far, when we came up back and we cracked open that box and went through all those little ballots, by far the answer was some form of open primaries, end the closed primary, do what Alaska did, ranked choice voting, election reform. That was really the origin story of why we ended up going that direction. And then the other part of it was back during our previous campaign. I met for the very first time the former Speaker of the House, Republican Bruce Newcomb, who really wanted Idaho to pursue some type of open primary, maybe some type of open primary with ranked choice. And everything grew out of those developments. Look, I got involved in Idaho politics. I grew up right in here in Bonner County. I got involved back in 2017 when a few of us, I think some of them are here today, we took an old 1978 Dodge camper and spray painted it bright green and put the slogan Medicaid for Idaho across the side of it and started driving all around the state advocating for health care coverage. And from the day we got started, I was accused of being funded by George Soros. When we literally had about $250. And we were driving a camper that one of my friends, I think, had got for $1,500. So from the very beginning, these things always, you get all these accusations. It is true that national organizations are supporting Proposition 1. But it cannot be denied that there is a grassroots groundswell behind this initiative. And why do the supporters around the country want to see these reforms? There are many different reasons, but the one thing that brings everyone together is that there is a real problem of accountability.
Oh, sorry, we were way over. I was so enthralled. Sorry.
Oh,
about that.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, but we can talk more about why different reformers around the state want to see these reforms. I'm happy to continue that conversation.
Sorry about that. This is my training day for moderation.
It's funny you mentioned Soros. I won't put on my tinfoil hat, but Fair Vote does get a substantial amount of money from Open Society Foundation. I'm just saying. So there's only one person here on payroll, by the way, here talking about Prop 1. It's not Scott, it's not me, and it's not Christie, as far as I understand. And our chief proponent and champion, you can look it up, Sunshine Reports, Luke gets paid. The last thing is, and let's just be clear, Luke wrote a paper about turning rural America progressive. So let's be very clear. I actually admire the pragmatism and shrewdness of the Prop 1 campaign. What they're really trying to do to open up the primaries is dissolve the influence of the Republican Party here in Idaho. So we can applaud in recognition of that truth and applaud their effort, and they're getting a lot of money now to make that happen. And who's going to fill that void? Is it the people? No. And I've actually dove into the academic literature trying to figure out open primaries. This claim is that it's for the people. It's going to represent a broader segment of the populace and the voting public. Well, paradoxically, what I found is actually open primaries give private big money interests more influence that replaces the void that's dissolved when they tear apart the Republican Party right here in Idaho. That's what's really going on here.
So in the Idaho legislature, we have 105 legislators. We have 4 times as many paid lobbyists for major corporations that are down there bending our ears, trying to pass law and policy that usually puts money into the pockets of their clients. That's how the system works. That's how government works. Parties are the ability of regular people, many of whom are going to work every day and are not paying attention every day to what's going on politically, to have their interests represented because they have a group of people that they can go to advance their interests without money. Now, we're 250 years into the American experiment. Half the states have ballot initiatives. Prop 1 is not a homegrown effort because after 250 years, you don't have 1/3 of the states that have ballot initiatives all having ranked choice voting ballot initiatives in the same year. That's not homegrown. That's why when you look at the money and you look at a $990 for Article 4, and that's the group that's put $2.2 million into this effort, and they only started 3 years ago. How many of you can start a 501c4 and have $11 million to fund ranked choice voting and put $2 million into Idaho? How many of you can do that today? That's not a homegrown effort. And when they were talking about it several years ago, that they wanted to advance ranked choice voting, all they did was they found some Idahoans who agreed with them to act as the local face. But the money, the one that's going to reach the majority of voters that have either already voted or vote on Tuesday, is funded from out of state because they are going to benefit from it, not because Idaho will benefit from it.
Excellent. The next question comes from the future governor of Idaho. She wanted me to give her the mic.
Campaigns have become very negative towards opponents, even resorting to spreading lies. Do you see Prop 1 changing how candidates have to appeal to voters?
Thanks for the question. So if we go back decades, hundreds of years, if you go back to the founding of the country, campaigns can be negative because one of the things that you want to do is to contrast your positions against your opponent's positions. The question is whether you actually lie about your opponents or whether you actually represent the actual differences. But that's all grounded in human behavior as to whether people are going to lie or tell the truth. There's nothing in Prop 1. There's nothing in ranked choice voting. There's nothing in the top 4 primary. There's nothing in a $200,000 marketing effort that is going to guarantee that people tell the truth. And how do we know that? Because Prop 1, the supporters of Prop 1 are running a multi-million-dollar effort right now where they are lying to voters. They have lied to voters and they've said that it is an open primary when it is not. They have lied to voters and they've said that only 9% of the population gets to participate in the primary election when that's not true. They have lied to voters and said that people get elected in the primary election when only nominees are selected in the primary election. They have lied to voters and said that 275,000 people are excluded from the primary election when by law, not a single registered voter in the state of Idaho is excluded from the primary election that we hold in May. It's open to everybody. So I would tell you that based on the evidence of this campaign in support of Prop 1, we're probably not going to see a change in how people get elected. And in fact, it could become worse when more money is out there to back the lies that we see in campaigns.
So there is a claim that open primaries moderate politics. And the argument might even have some plausibility with how people run a campaign. But how do they actually govern? There's absolutely almost zero evidence that governance is somehow moderated. You can look in California, and you can look at other states across the country. What's really interesting, speaking about governance, this is the bigger issue, actually. And it goes back to the money question. When you actually look at legislation in Washington, D.C., Princeton University, they did a study, looked at like 1,779 different policies, and they wanted to look at those policies, were they championed by legislators representing their constituents, or was that legislation being championed by some other interest other than the constituents? You know what they found? They found that 90% of that legislation forwarded didn't represent the constituents at all. Who do you think it represented? It represented moneyed interests. And that's why we keep talking about the money here. We keep talking about those millions of dollars coming in from Washington, D.C. Do they really care about the average Idahoan? We know how most people in Washington, D.C. look at us small peons. They don't like us. So what's really their aim here? And I mentioned what their aim is here. It's precisely to dissolve the grassroots Republican Party in Idaho. It's okay, it's fine, we can all admit it, right? So we just have to make a decision. Do we want to vote for the regular Idahoan and stand up to these big money interests coming from Washington, D.C., or are we going to keel over, after their millions and millions and millions of dollars by all the TV and radio spots? I think I know what the answer is. Thank you.
So there's a question of why is something like this on the ballot in so many states at once, and Scott indicated that that could just be because it's all being, pulled by puppet strings from the outside, and that I or others who launched Idahoans for Open Primaries are just puppets being pulled up from the outside. That's really a slander, and you can't prove that because it's not true. And I dare you to prove it. I dare you to prove it. This campaign was started by Idahoans, built by Idahoans. That is a fact. And it is very likely the case that the thing motivating organizations around the country is similar to what motivated us, which is that we saw the breakthrough in Alaska in 2020 when they reformed their system. We saw the outcome that it had for Alaska, And we thought that is a really good system. That's the tradition of this country, is we have reform and we try to make things better. And we look for the best system that we can find and we try to model after that. And what is the success of that system? There is and this goes to the question, it is not. It is simply false, and I dare anyone to say otherwise or to prove otherwise. It is simply false that this favors one party or the other. In Washington, D.C., they're trying to implement a top 4 primary with ranked choice voting. Guess who opposes it? The Democratic Party establishment. Guess who's opposing it in Nevada? The Democratic Party establishment. That's because the groups that tend to oppose these reforms are entrenched parties that are in power. And it's not about favoring one party or the other. It's really about favoring voters. It's about accountability to voters.
I have a question right here.
Well, I want to speak to our future governor. Where did she go? The spirit of your question is what we should all be so proud of you for. Because what you said was, are politicians going to lie all the time? Will this stop the lying? I don't know, but I like what you're thinking. And, I will say, though, the whole idea that this initiative is about destroying the Republican Party. I've been a Republican, always been a registered Republican, except for about 5 years after they closed the primary. Out of rebellion, I popped out for a while as an independent, and then I came back as a Republican. I will always be registered as a Republican. I have no reason not to. I'm here tonight speaking on behalf of my fellow veterans, who some of them who choose to be independent have a right to vote in a primary that they help pay for. That is our argument. It is not about whether we don't like the Republican Party. None of them have ever said that. None of them ever said stomp out the Republicans. Most of Idaho are Republicans. There's different flavors of Republicans, right? There's some that are moderate, there's some that are very, very conservative. But that's okay, because this ranked choice voting gives us a chance to pick who represents our values. And we all should have a say in that, not just the parties.
Okay. Hi, I just want you to know that I was born and raised in church. I actually went to Whitworth University, have a certificate in lay ministry and teaching the Bible. The one thing my grandmother told me is you go to hell for lying the same as you do for stealing. And to this day, I cannot tolerate being lied to, which means I don't lie because I've been to the woodshed for it. And for Mr. Herndon to say it's okay for me to lie just this once, to betray everything I believe, and I think lying is one of those 10 things that I was raised with. And so for me to compromise my integrity, whether it's Republican or Democrat, I don't like choosing either, but I do like having the choice of all the candidates that are out there to choose the ones that fit my values, which I don't think all of us share, because some of us lie. And so, Mr. Herndon, I would like to know why I should believe anything you say when you advocate that people should lie just this once in order to be able to vote in the Republican primary.
So I actually don't believe people should lie. What I think they should do, instead of blowing up Idaho's election system, and Prop 1 is not about parties. In other words, it's not to take down the Republican Party. The effect of Prop 1 is to prop up corporations and their ability to influence Idaho's governance. That's the reality. And the opposition to Prop 1, my opposition to Prop 1 isn't because I think the Republican Party is perfect. It's because parties are the vehicle for people who don't have money, who only have a little bit of time to volunteer, who only peripherally participate with their neighbors in attempting to change their governance. It's their ability to have a voice in what happens in Idaho. So I started not as a Republican. In other words, I was registered as a Republican, but then I wouldn't vote for the Republican candidates often. And then I decided if I don't like the Republican Party, or if I don't like the Democratic Party, I can actually go participate in that party and change that party. So you don't even have to lie. Parties are groups of people that share a majority of principles. Maybe they share 80% common principles. They don't agree on everything. So saying you're a Republican isn't saying you agree with everything. You're not lying. You get involved in parties because it's the way you fight the major corporations and billionaires that run the country. I just faced a bill this year by Bayer that, do you think they were running a bill in Idaho that advanced their corporate interests, a major Swiss corporation, because they cared about you? They cared about their bottom line. That's what we're up against. And so we join parties, and if we don't love what the party's about, then we change that party. But guess what? I welcome more parties. More parties of people who share ideas. More competition is better for Idaho, is better for America.
Speaking of lies, and this goes back to my opening, I'm a little concerned, almost offended that, what's happening here is that this veterans group, let's talk about it for a second. So the story is that veterans are somehow disproportionately silenced. And why did they pick veterans? Why did they select a veterans group to do this? I'll point you first to the blue handout here. I'm going to get to the why. The blue handout here, look at what one of the most trusted institutions is in this country. One of the only two, the military. We have high sentiment, okay, and empathy for our active duty and our veterans because they've sacrificed for this country. So this is emotional manipulation. And the reason why I can prove that, the reason why I can prove it is go to their website and look at their big, bold claim. Half of veterans are independents. Look at the green flyer I gave you. Pew Research, the most comprehensive study on this. It's a lie. It's simply not true. So let's identify the lie, and I'm still challenging Christy here to please vet and prove to me otherwise that Pew Research is wrong. But if we want to call out lies, then I'm going to call out one right now because I think we all deserve the truth. Thank you.
Veterans as emotional manipulators. That's a new one I haven't heard for a while. You know, when I was speaking down in Lewiston not long ago, and a veteran came up to me afterward, just the irony that some of our fellow vets are not allowed to vote in the primary. And he said to me, when I served in Iraq, we laid down fire so the Afghanistans could vote. Yet in my own country, if I go back to Idaho and I'm an independent, I'm not voting. So you can call it manipulative emotion, whatever you wanted to call it. I call it service to our country. And that's not crap.
Sir, one second. We're not going to have any outbursts in the crowd. If you could, no. I understand, sir. We want to make sure that all the information comes out of the panelists. This is the time for it. Sir. Sir, there's many other people who have had their hand up. I'm trying to get around to everybody. So.
I'd like to speak to that last question.
The one over here?
Yep.
Yes, excellent.
Look, probably the biggest mistruth out there is what's been repeated several times tonight, that this initiative is somehow an effort to turn Idaho blue. The truth is that we're taking after a reform that was passed in Alaska. There's a reason why all the signs talk about California and they don't talk about Alaska. They talk about California because it evokes fear, anger, anxiety, right? It does not have the same type of emotional effect to say, don't turn Idaho into Alaska. So they never say it. And here's the fact about Alaska. When this reform passed in the state of Alaska, they elected the same number of Republicans and the same number of Democrats as they elected before. The opponents of these reforms focus on one election out of over 100 elections in Alaska. The same time that Sarah Palin lost, which is what they always talk about, there was a conservative Republican endorsed by Trump who won. And in the state legislature, they elected the same number of Republicans and the same number of Democrats as before. It did not turn Alaska blue, and it won't turn Idaho blue. What it will do is it will elect candidates who are accountable to the voters who they're supposed to serve. That's what the reform is all about. And Scott's big example of how this somehow makes government accountable to corporations, that was fascinating to me that his example was the pharmaceutical company Bayer, because guess what? Bayer donated $50,000 to the No on One campaign. Look it up in the Sunshine Reports. It was Bayer and Idaho's richest individual, Idaho's only billionaire, is one of the biggest backers of the No on One campaign.
You're over time, sir.
So let's tell the truth.
Okay, I have a multiple-pronged question.
We've got a lot of those tonight.
Yeah, I'm going to try to keep it topical. But first off, I want to tell you who I am. I'm a rhino. I've been a lifelong anarchist, and I actually joined the Republican Party so that I could vote against Mr. Herndon in the May primary this year. So, as somebody who had to compromise on my own morals to sign up for a party that I agree with nothing on, I can say that I did that, and it was a conscious choice that I didn't take lightly, but I felt like I had to do that in order to partake in the system. So, also to your point, sir, about referencing the Alaska vote and how one of the things that they ended up doing was putting up a convicted felon. I think that's hilarious because look at who you're going to vote for president on Tuesday. So
we're only talking about Idaho politics right now.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm getting off point here. So I also wanted to say, as far as Reclaim Idaho goes, Mr. Herndon, you railed against that, continuously because of the money. And I want to say that the Reclaim Idaho is the only reason that my family has health care. So there's a dollar value for what actually makes positive changes in people's lives. And I wanted to say that about the Reclaim Idaho. So as far as my question is for Mr. Herndon, as far as the thing that you said earlier about how when the second round comes around of this vote, that there's a section of the votes that were cast that go away, but in the second round of voting, you kept referring to, but it's my understanding that it's only one. You already voted, correct? So could you please clarify that for us?
Okay, so not everybody, first of all, some people are not going to fill out their ballots correctly. And so if they don't fill out their ballots correctly, they have spoiled ballots. Some people are not going to multiple choice their ballots, and they're only going to pick their favorite candidate. And they're not going to, if there are 4 other candidates on the ballot, they're not going to choose from the other 3. And if their candidate doesn't end up making it to another round, then they will not have a voice in that other round. They could have, of course, they could have done multiple choice, but that would be, for example, in order to do that, you obviously feel very strongly about President Trump. And if ranked choice voting applied to the presidential election, in order to have a voice in subsequent rounds of voting, you may have to vote for President Trump in order to have a choice. And that's what you're going to be asked to do, because you're going to be asked to rank all 4 candidates on the ballot if you want to have a voice throughout the ranked choice voting. It's not a requirement, but if you want to have a voice. So if you want to talk about your vote not counting in later round, there is the potential that your ballot becomes exhausted because you did not make 4 choices during that election. Also, because of that, you could have a final winner of the election that ended up with a minority of the number of voters that showed up that day, even though at that round they won a majority of that round. But what I talked about earlier was the fact that if I had a choice, right now you have 9 candidates on the Idaho ballot for president, and if we were ranked choice voting them, I may want to know what happened after round 1. This is how traditional runoffs work, and this is not how ranked choice voting works. I'd want to know what happened in round 1 before I make my second choice. I don't want to make decisions about subsequent rounds not having the information of what has already transpired. So that's why I don't believe that represents human behavior and the best human decision making. Ranked choice voting does not do that.
I'd like to hear from the pro side as a counterpoint, because we've been having a lot of questions directed at one person. I want to make sure it's being even and being tossed back and forth.
So let's get in a little bit into some technical points here. There was a claim earlier that a winner in a ranked choice voting election doesn't always get a majority, and therefore they don't represent the broader community. And Michael referred a lot to the academic literature. I'm not always sure like which academy or which literature you're talking about, and there's not consistent findings across the board on a lot of these questions. But here's the truth. What that literature has found, what the studies have found, when candidates get below 50% of the vote, they typically, in nearly every case, they still get over 45. So they get somewhere between 45 and 50. And our point is, if someone gets 45% of the vote and they're declared the winner, that's a lot better than getting votes from about 9% of the population, which is what happens in a closed primary. And that's the truth. So I'll take 45% over 9% every time. That's always going to be a better outcome. The idea that if you don't rank all the candidates, your vote is thrown out, that's not just false. That argument was rejected over and over again by decades of federal court rulings. The major one that most people go back to is a 2011 federal court ruling called Dudum v. Arnst. You can go read it for yourself. What they found is that this issue called ballot exhaustion does not equal votes being tossed out. It does not equal people being disenfranchised. We could talk about what it technically means. I'd be happy to stay for an hour if anyone wants to talk more about that. But the courts have repeatedly found that that's not true. Ballots do not get tossed. People do not get disenfranchised.
This reminds me of the Kathy Newman, Jordan Peterson interview when she kept saying, "So you're saying." I don't think either one of us said your ballots are tossed because it's exhausted. No, I was referring to spoiled ballots, and I clarified the difference between exhausted and spoiled ballots. Yes, I did. Good thing this is recorded. And spoiled ballots are something that they never mention. Isn't that interesting? They keep focusing on this tossed ballot because of an exhausted ballot. That's only one example, okay? The bigger example that I'm more concerned about, and we're talking about disenfranchisement of voters, is all of the people that do, in fact, get confused. It's a fact. Now, maybe you're a more sophisticated voter than the average voter, Christy, but if we actually look at the data, we have a 10-fold increase in ballot errors. When we look across jurisdictions across the country, those spoiled ballot rates increase exponentially. Those are people's voices that will never be heard because of ranked choice voting. And I'd ask you this, when you look at that complexity, when you look at the trust we talked about in the Idaho's election system, it's very exceptional. When you look across the country, the trust in the election systems are in the tank, but in Idaho, 2/3 of Idahoans believe in the election integrity here. What will that complexity, that increased disenfranchisement and spoiled ballots, the increased costs and the lack of transparency, we haven't talked about that. Hopefully somebody will ask a question about the costs and the lack of transparency. What will that do to this cherished, rare, high-trust institution that we have in here in Idaho?
Well, how about you just give veterans and active duty personnel that are independent, you give them the right to vote, and they'll see if they can figure it out. I'm pretty sure they can.
So I want to get through more questions, and you know how you have an idea, and it seems like such a great idea in your head when you craft it. It seems like I'm going to have everybody up there, but we're taking too long in between the questions. So how about we do an answer from the pro side, answer from the no side, and you guys can hand them mics back and forth, but we'll just do one from one side, one from the other, and we'll still limit it to the 2 minutes, but I just want to be able to get to more. I have so many people waving their hand, they think that I'm just seeing them, but I have like a group of people. Anyway, here's the next question.
Good evening. So I would like to ask the pro Proposition 1. You've raised the model for Alaska several times as the gold standard. Mm-hmm. And I'd like you to explain to us why they are trying to repeal it in Alaska. Mm-hmm. What have Alaskans discovered since it put into place that they find so objectionable that they want to repeal it? Thank you.
So let's do one answer from the pro side, then one from the con side, the against side.
Well, it's very important when people say, in Alaska, they are trying to repeal it. Who's they? And I think if you look closely at it, you'll find, and it's not a perfect match, but you'll find that generally, the people trying to repeal it are the same people who opposed it to begin with. And what they've done is after the reform passed with the majority of the vote, they put an initiative on the ballot to repeal it. The voters of Alaska have not voted on that repeal yet. They're going to vote on it 5 days from now, and we'll see what happens. But the claim that somehow Alaskans have turned against the reform, that's not true. That's like us saying everyone in Idaho supports Prop 1 just because we got it on the ballot. It hasn't been weighed in on by the voters yet. And what we do know about Alaska is that, again, they did not elect more Democrats or more Republicans than before. That this reform did not lead to a blue wave in Alaska. The partisan balance remained the same. But what did happen is they elected leaders regardless of party that better represented the voters who they're supposed to serve. And one outcome of that is in the very first legislative session, you actually saw members of both major parties working together to solve the problems that the public cares about. So Alaska, similar to Idaho, has struggled for years with funding their public education system. They passed the largest increase in funding for public education in decades while also balancing the budget. They did that in Alaska. And representatives from both parties worked together to get that done. That's the type of problem solving and accountability that Proposition 1 is all about.
So what's interesting is while a lot of times we argue in political campaigns about one side's ideas versus the other, the actual result of the Idaho legislature right now with our current system is that whether you're Democrat or Republican, we all work together pretty well. I respect every Democrat down there. And in fact, often if you look at the hundreds of bills that we vote on in a session, many of them will be bipartisan votes where it'll be all of us supporting the same policy or none of us supporting the same policy, and it doesn't have to do with political party affiliation. So the system right now, as far as actual on-the-ground governance, does work. An example Luke just brought up about public education is we have greatly increased the funding of public education just over the last couple of years, while also in a bipartisan manner greatly giving property tax relief to voters. And we do that in the current system. On the ground in the current system, whether you're Democrat or whether you're Republican or whether you're Constitution Party or Independent, if you call me as your senator and you have a problem with an agency in the lake at Priest Lake and the Siphon Project, we get together as Democrats and Republicans and we solve that regardless of partisan affiliation. The political fights, partisan political fights, really only happen during campaigns. 99% of what we do in the legislature, we're mostly in agreement. We're very respectful, and we're never disrespectful to each other. So that's not a problem that needs to be solved. If we're worried about alienating veteran voters, and the problem is that they feel like they would compromise by having to affiliate Republican to vote in the Republican primary, even though we could easily develop 10 other parties. The Proposition 1 doesn't solve that problem. The solution to that problem is talk to the Republican Party in the legislature about opening primaries and not closing primaries to unaffiliated voters. So this whole multi-million-dollar effort that brings great risk to our election security is not really the answer to the problems they've raised tonight. And so I think we should be against Prop 1.
Thank you.
Hi, my name, well, that's really close.
You got to hold it close.
I got to hold it close?
Yeah,
Okay, I'll hold it close. My name is Michaela, and tonight there's been a lot of rhetoric about Prop 1 turning Idaho blue. And there's a congressional race on the ballot this year that is a four-way race. And I was just curious if you could give an example of how that race may turn out, how our current system is with a four-way vote versus how that may look in terms of ranked choice voting with regards to the one Democrat on the ticket.
I can't really speak to that four-way race. I've heard, you said opponents here claiming it's turning Idaho blue. Just heard it again. Neither one of us said that, just to be very clear. You do hear that sometimes they refer to Alaska because the first time in I don't know how many election cycles a Democrat was elected in what had traditionally been a Republican seat, because the Republicans in the first round of tabulation took 60% of the votes, but the Democrat ended up winning in the final round of tabulation, RCV. And that's why sometimes you hear about RCV turning elections blue. I can't speak to there's a House race with 4 members?
Electing a Democratic candidate versus how that could look with ranked choice voting. That's my question.
Sure. I guess, obviously in the primary election, you'd have the Republican nominee, and then you'd have the Democrat Libertarian, and who's the fourth party? Let's just call it Constitution Party. I'm not familiar with the race. And then they go to the general election. I'm sorry? What's unfortunate? Okay, whatever. We're talking about ranked choice voting right now and its impact. Okay, I don't know who the fourth party is, right? And actually, speaking of that, it's a good point. I'm glad you raised that. When you look at an open primary and you see 20 to 40 candidates on there, how do you think a regular voter is going to navigate that? How are they going to navigate that? With education.
I hear it all over, is that this is going to turn Idaho blue. Snippets, questions, right? So I'm asking you, there's a great example on the ballot for this race, 4 candidates. How can you please describe how that may turn out right now versus how that might turn out with ranked choice voting? That's what I'm asking you.
So hypothetically, based on voting patterns and demographics and party registration in Idaho, the Republican has a likely chance of winning the general election, obviously, right? Now, if we go to ranked choice voting, actually, what you find is third-party candidates, it's actually a big argument from the proponents, do not fare any better in ranked choice voting. The evidence bears that out. So if we're hoping for a third party, Constitution, Libertarian, to be more represented in elections and win more elections, it does not happen under ranked choice voting. So I would not predict any difference. Thank you.
And if we could get something from the pro side.
Well, I'm glad at least, by the end of the debate, although I'm happy to keep going, but by the end here, we're agreeing that Prop 1 isn't about turning Idaho blue, because I am pretty sure earlier on you said you had a few comments about how the true motive is to eviscerate the Republican Party or to undermine the Republican Party. And we can go back and watch the tape. And it's just not true. It's just not true. Why would there be such a coalition that's cross-partisan in support of Proposition 1? And while we're at it, just some basic misinformation. The idea that there's 40 candidates in the top 4 primary, that is just a case of cherry picking one election in Alaska, where there was an extreme situation where a member of Congress died in office. He had held that office for something like over 40 years. So there was a real bonanza of candidates who entered the race. The typical election in Alaska does not have a large number of candidates running in the primary, so that's just false. It's also false that there's a whole lot of spoiled ballots in Alaska. 99.9% of ballots in Alaska were valid in the last election. 99.9%. Now you could say, even if there were a few dozen more spoiled ballots, that's real disenfranchisement and that's a problem, and I would sympathize with that argument. But why aren't we worried about the 70 or 80% of Idahoans who don't participate in the closed primary and therefore don't have a voice? And the answer to the question, what would happen in the current, Congressional District 1 race, clearly the Republican candidate would win. The big difference under Proposition 1 is that the Republican candidate would be much more likely to be accountable to the broader community of voters, because that candidate would have an interest in going out and trying to win votes all throughout the district, not just in that small closed primary electorate.
All right, we got a question in the back here.
I mean, the real reason for Prop 1, which we seem to be avoiding, is to answer the question, are our elected officials responding to the wishes of the people? And the answer to that in the current system is obviously no, because the most important issues that we've had, that we've been successful to get done, have come through initiatives. The initiative for Medicaid expansion, very important for people's lives. The legislature could not find a way to get that done. They kept playing games with it for, a decade or two. And then also school funding. We finally had the pressure put on the legislature because of the initiative, which was obviously going to pass. The people of Idaho backed Medicaid expansion enormously. Right now, Prop 1 is going to accomplish its goal, which is to get officials in Boise that are going to answer our needs. Answer that, please.
Well, I'll just say that's a big part of what motivated me to get involved in election reform and really start to look closely at the Alaska model and think this could make a really big positive difference in Idaho, because I had this experience of advocating for Medicaid expansion and going all across the state and seeing that tens of thousands of Idahoans wanted it, and thousands of Idahoans desperately needed it. And then when it finally made it to the ballot, it passes with 61% of the vote, even though for 6 straight years the legislature had the opportunity to do it and wouldn't lift a finger. And people every single year were dying preventable deaths all across the state, and the legislature wouldn't lift a finger. So yeah, there's a big disconnect between the needs and interests of the majority of the population and what we're seeing in our legislature. And that is the fundamental principle behind Proposition 1, trying to solve that disconnect. And I think if you really went through issue by issue, you'd find some ways that legislators in Boise, currently representing Idaho, do align with the popular view out there in the public, but on a whole lot of issues they don't. And these aren't just marginal issues. Sometimes they're life and death issues. Sometimes they're about public education, the types of things that determine the opportunities of our children. We need a government that is accountable to all of the people who have to live under that government. That's what we're trying to achieve here. It has nothing to do with one particular ideology, one particular partisan agenda. At the core of it, it's about accountability.
What's that?
So in the legislature this year, we considered hundreds of pieces of legislation. And the question, sir, presupposes that none of the other hundreds of pieces that were signed into law didn't meet actual needs of Idahoans. So it presupposed that the Idaho legislature is not effective at addressing real problems and demands of Idaho voters, when in fact, the reason that we passed hundreds of pieces of legislation every year is because we are being responsive to real problems that Idaho voters care about. The problem is we sometimes live in our own silos and we don't understand that everybody has a different opinion of what government should be used to do. And right now, the majority of the Idaho legislature at every vote on hundreds of bills is meeting the expectations of Idaho voters today. There is nothing about Proposition 1. Notice Medicaid expansion got handled in the current system without Proposition 1. Notice that increased funding for public education happened in the current system without Proposition 1. None of the problems that have been needed to be addressed in Idaho are incapable of being addressed.
No outbursts, sir.
Are incapable of being addressed in the current system. And that's the key. The current system is working, but Prop 1, what it will introduce is we'll have elections that no longer will Bonner County, which is not connected to the internet, be responsible for counting its own votes, because to accomplish the ranked choice voting portion of the ballot, Bonner County is part of District 1. The ballots are going to have to be transmitted electronically and combined with Boundary County in order to tabulate the subsequent instant runoff rounds of voting. And that is going to subject Idaho taxpayers to cost, but more importantly, it's going to subject our elections to security potential issues that we have to be on the watch out for.
Okay. I would like to go back to ranked choice voting and how there's not going to be one vote per voter. Luke, at the very beginning, admitted that Republicans are the majority in Idaho. And so what this serves to do is actually, it's not to replace the Republican Party or remove the Republican Party. What it's going to do is to undermine the majority voice in the state. When you are not giving the majority of the voters their voice, and you're giving it to a machine to reallocate votes to second choice, third choice. So in a situation where you rank four candidates, your top choice gets dropped off, then that vote goes to your next highest choice. That means that two votes on that ballot are now going to one candidate. So at the end of an election, when you have more votes in a race than ballots, there's a problem. So you're undermining the democratic election process with ranked choice voting. And so earlier also Luke mentioned that the most votes wins. So my question is define a vote. Is it a vote that the person is giving, or is it a vote that the machine that's tabulating this algorithm, is it the extra votes that are being given to those other candidates by the machine, or is it the original vote that the voter gave? Does that make sense?
I think I understand it. I understand it. Okay, the first thing is there's this idea that ranked choice voting violates the principle of one person, one vote. Again, we could argue all night about that, but what everyone here needs to know is that question has been taken up multiple times by federal and state courts, and the claim was rejected every time. If it were true that ranked choice voting really did violate the principle of one person, one vote, it wouldn't be in place in 60 different communities all across the country. It would have been ruled unconstitutional decades ago. It hasn't been because it does not violate that principle. Just 2 years ago, the Alaska Supreme Court ruled that ranked choice voting does not violate one person, one vote. In a ranked choice election, they said, these exact words, they said, every vote counts once. And the reason why is because, and here, let me pause here. It's not a machine doing a mysterious algorithm. It's a very simple third grade math calculation. And here's exactly what it is, and I repeated it a few times earlier. The last place candidate gets eliminated. If that was your first choice, your vote goes to your second choice. Last place candidate gets eliminated. If that was your first choice, your vote now goes to your second choice. The reason why it doesn't violate one person, one vote is because your vote, in the final tally, your vote only counts for that one candidate. The vote only counts for that candidate. It no longer counts for that last place candidate who got eliminated. It only counts towards one candidate. So you could disagree with that. You should know that you're disagreeing with decades of court rulings. And not that courts are perfect every time, but you'd expect at least one court to agree with you if you were right over like decades. So it does not violate one person, one vote. There's no complicated algorithm done by a machine. It's simple math, and it works.
It's third grade math, and it's so easy. We need new machines and software to do all the tabulation. That could cost the state $40 million. Yeah, 60 communities in the country do have ranked choice voting. What Luke doesn't mention is the scores and scores of communities that no longer use ranked choice voting. Utah, for instance, introduced the pilot program where I think 23 different cities initially participated. 20 dropped out of it. They said, this isn't for us. Okay, and the reason why, they did their own surveying of their own voters, it was unpopular. They said it was too complicated, and they didn't trust the counting of the votes because it's all changed. It's all changed. In Pierce County, Washington, they tried it back in 2008. It cost them a couple $1 million. They ended up asking the voters, how did you feel about it? The majority of the voters, too complicated, didn't trust it. And you see that across the country when you start looking at jurisdictions that have tried it. For every jurisdiction that still has it, you've got another jurisdiction that got rid of it. And there's a reason why they're getting rid of it. It makes radical changes to how we vote. Instead of 3 bubbles, you've got 16. You have a much increased spoiled ballot rate because people are confused. Luke actually talked about turnout and getting more voter participation. Ranked choice voting actually represses voter turnout as well, anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4%. So we need to really question, does ranked choice voting make Idaho elections better? And I'd argue one last thing, open primaries. Luke mentions this is about holding the politicians accountable to the people. But here's the problem, when we can get an anecdote from Alaska, and maybe it has something to do with ranked choice voting. But when you look at the body of evidence at open primaries and ranked choice voting, you don't see any increase in accountability of the politicians to the people. They're not legislating differently at all. And that's our concern. It's not so much about turning Idaho blue, it's about by dissolving a freely associated political party and its influence, somebody fills the void. And what we've both been saying here on that stage, that big money that's coming in from DC, that is their intent to fill the void. And the politicians will be, guess what, accountable to them.
All right. Got another question in the back here.
I'm glad that you raised that issue. I'm speaking as an elected committee man from the Beach Precinct in Sandpoint, Republican. I sit on the same county committee that Scott does. Scott's our chair. And my experience there is led me to really support Prop 1, despite the committee's official opposition to it. The reason for that is that what's going on here, and it's hard for us to talk about clearly, is a split within the Republican Party itself. There's a part of the party, some percentage of it, that's substantial, that sees the existing electeds who control the state legislature, the existing Republican electeds have gone too far to the right. They're extremist. They're looking to bring too much religion into the legislation, too much of the various kinds of reforms, so-called, that are opposed. That's what's really happening here, and this is a reaction to that. And that's what Luke is saying about it not being accountable. The opposition to this is coming from the grassroots Republicans. I was recruited by grassroots Republicans to try to make a difference in this committee, which there's not enough of us to do at this point. But maybe more will get elected in the next round. But this is a good method for forcing the extremists in the legislature to shift a bit back, to get out of that extremist mode entirely.
No question. Would panelists like to comment on what he said? Or we can move to another question.
Yeah, I don't think Prop 1's going to change anything. It doesn't offer any promise to change anything about the legislature having to take action related to things that are going on in our culture. You use the word extreme. A lot of Idaho Republican voters think it is extreme that in women's college sports, biological males want to compete. They think that's extreme, and so Idaho, for example, had to take up legislation, one of hundreds of pieces of legislation on everyday ordinary subjects, to say that males should not unfairly compete against our females in college sports. I think that was reasonable. Some people think that's extreme. We took a bill up this year that passed overwhelmingly with Republicans and Democrats in favor that said we don't want online pornographers distributing unfair, immoral material to our innocent children. And it turned out that passed almost overwhelmingly, Democrats and Republicans in favor of that House bill. And what was that a response to? It's a response to the fact that we're in a new world technological environment where kids were getting pornography on the internet. And Democrats and Republicans did not think that was a good idea. And some people in this room might think that was extreme, but Democrats and Republicans supported it. And before or after Prop 1, Democrats and Republicans and Constitution Party and Libertarians would probably have an interest in protecting children. It's the nature of the society and the culture we live in today. I think that is what many of us find is extreme, is that we have cultural battles going on that were unheard of throughout the history of Idaho and America.
I think I agree with Scott on a number of things. One of them is always using my full 2 minutes, so respect for that. I think we do agree that if some piece of legislation is called extreme, but actually the vast majority of the population believes in it, then that legislation deserves to pass, because that's representative government. And if any of us don't like that, our obligation, it wouldn't be to change the system, it'd be to go out and try to persuade people that it's not the right type of legislation. So if something's being called extreme that's supported by the population, that's one thing. The type of extremism that, I'll speak for myself, that I'm very worried about is when there's legislation being proposed and passing that is opposed by the vast majority of people in Idaho. So let me give you an example. In 2021, the Idaho legislature passed a law that virtually killed the ballot initiative process. In that same year, the voters of Idaho were polled and they were asked, do you support citizen initiatives? Should the process be made more difficult? Should the process survive in Idaho? Over 80% of Idahoans wanted there to be a strong ballot initiative process in the state of Idaho. And it included 66% of Republicans. But the legislature was so mad about Medicaid expansion that they turned around and they gutted the ballot initiative process. They virtually killed it with a major piece of legislation that the Idaho Supreme Court ended up calling a form of tyranny. And the only reason that legislation was overturned and why we still have a ballot initiative process is because we fought back, filed a lawsuit, and the court took our side and struck that legislation down.
Here's the next question. One caveat, let's round this back around to the subject of ranked choice voting, and also from the crowd, if we could keep the commenting down, because I do want them to be able to say what they have to say. Again, if you have a negative response to it, take that to the ballot box. But we need to hear what they're saying, and this is specifically about ranked choice voting.
Thank you. Yeah, Mike, there's a couple elements there that I see in regard to the open primary and the ranked choice voting, and I'm kind of curious how those two elements came put together. It would seem like a simple matter to open up the primary if that was the real crux of people's complaints about how elections are done. Ranked choice voting to me kind of seems like you're playing Jenga. Everybody knows what Jenga is. You got a stack of blocks and you keep pulling one out until it falls down. And that's kind of like how we're representing ranked choice voting right now. I will disagree with the previous speaker about the government having too much religion in their discussions. I think we're all moral people, regardless of where we stand on the political spectrum. But I would like to see, I was very disappointed as I spent a little period of my life in advertising, and I learned real quick that they're very good at finding out what people like and what smells good and what tastes good to get you to buy it. And that's how I feel about this open primary thing with all the advertisings that have taken place that only tell you about open primary. Right. Okay? If that's a bait and switch, that's what it feels like. Because ranked choice voting is a mess in my regard. And
could you direct your question?
Yeah. How do you feel about the connection? Do you see any to me, they're vastly different. Maybe my optics are different. They don't seem to go hand in hand. And forgot what else.
I'm gonna put a timer on you.
I think that's a great question. I think that's a great question, and this is the type of question that we ought to be talking about, because we ought to leave here tonight more informed than we came in about Proposition 1 and how it's designed and why it was designed that way. So here's what everyone needs to understand. If we didn't include ranked choice voting in this proposition, it wouldn't work. And the reason is because if all we did was just a top 4 open primary, and we just sent the top 4 candidates from the primary on to the general, when those candidates showed up on that general election ballot, they could split the vote 4 ways. And the winner could end up being someone who only got 26% of the vote. And that would go against our original intention, which is, after all, to get elected leaders who represent the broader community, not just 26%. So the reason why we had to add ranked choice voting or some type of runoff system, which is what ranked choice voting is we had to have a way to guarantee that the winner has broad support. And I know that, and Michael and Scott earlier talked about, we're not always guaranteeing in every instance that the candidate gets over 50%, but in every instance we're guaranteeing that they have a whole lot more than 26%, usually close to 50% or more, which is far, far better than the current system, where candidates are elected in closed primaries after only proving that they really have support from about 9% of the population a lot of the time. So that's the basic answer. If you only had the open primary part of this, and with the top 4, and you didn't have a way to guarantee that the actual winner doesn't split the vote, it wouldn't work. So the two really go together. The core idea is the open primary. Ranked choice voting is what makes it work.
I'd mentioned that jungle primaries typically have top 2, but in this case, it's top 4, and so that is why you need ranked choice voting, because they chose to go with top 4, by the way. I will say that, hold on, where did I go? And I lost my train of thought here for a second. And the reason why they go from top 2 to top 4 is, as I'd mentioned, if you only had top 2 in the open primaries, they're both going to be Republicans at the end of the day. If you get top 4, and that's fine, that's by design, there's a good chance that you're going to get somebody that's not a Republican in the general election. So let's not make any bones about it. That's what this is about. And so now we're forced to accept ranked choice voting. And I've mentioned all of the deleterious impacts of ranked choice voting. And what's really interesting is that question from the marketer. Actually, this is what I remembered now, is when you look at the language from the proponents of Prop 1, it's constantly open primaries, open primaries. Look at all the millions of dollars of advertising. It's open primaries. They barely mention ranked choice voting. It's not an accident. And the reason is when you look at polling, open primaries polls fairly well among Democrats and unaffiliated, and actually even among some Republicans. It's kind of a mix. When you go to ranked choice voting, on the other hand, it's very unpopular. It's very unpopular. So it is a battle of language, by the way. You're absolutely right. It is a battle of marketing. They just happen to have a lot more money. But let's be clear, when you get one, you get the other. And that was my point to the independent voter over there. If you're voting for open primaries, you also have to accept everything that comes with ranked choice voting. And I think that's the problem that most Idahoan voters have with Proposition 1 at this point.
Hi, I want to thank all you coming tonight. This is great, learning a lot. I think it was Thomas Sowell that said that the progressive movement is about replacing what works with what sounds good. And I'm a little concerned about this. Oh, and by the way, veterans we respect highly, and if they choose to unaffiliate, to not affiliate with a party, which is actually affiliating with a group that's unaffiliated, they get the benefit that they go directly to the general election. In other words, if you want to run, if a candidate wants to run unaffiliated, he doesn't have to go through a primary process. He doesn't have to get the approval of a party, the members of a party to vote him in. So to say that somehow the unaffiliated are being greatly disenfranchised isn't really true, because they get to bypass the primary system and go right to the general election. And everybody gets to vote in a general election. Everybody. Everybody. So I've been involved in elections for a long time. I've volunteered in election offices. When the state party decided to do the caucus, I was the primary architect of how to actually make that work. Okay? And I'm deeply concerned about how ranked choice voting is going to actually work. Because right now, we go in, we sign on a paper ballot, it goes through a machine at the precinct level, and then it goes to a tabulation machine at the county level, and then we get the results that night. In this system, you can't tabulate at the county level, because the votes that you count, which votes you count on which ballot, depend on all the other ballots in the state. Okay? Everybody's ballots. And it's illegal, unlawful in Idaho to transmit, to connect a tabulating machine to the internet. Okay? So I go in, I vote my paper ballot, I put it in the ballot box, and then what happens at my precinct level? Well, somehow they have to be transported to some central location. Now in Alaska, they've got 3 regional voting centers. So they were already set up for that. In Idaho, we've got 44 counties. Okay? So we got to train all those people. We have to have machines for all those people for collecting it originally. And I don't know how it's actually going to get. Are we going to read them at the county level, and then are we going to send them to Boise or some central location, and then they're going to run them through a machine there? And by the way, I don't know how many people here are happy about all the ballots in the state at once running through a Dominion machine, but it's either a Dominion or I think American Elector Systems. It's one of those two. Those are the only ones that have certified software for ranked choice voting. The current equipment that we have in Idaho, according to our Secretary of State, won't work. And there's not a little patch that some guy in Utah can stuff in there, because it needs to be certified software. So the question I have for you is this. How are we actually going to count these ballots? And then if there's a problem, how do we audit it? We can't do a county audit, right? The only way to audit RCV is to run it through the same machine again and get exactly the same result. We can't do an independent audit. So my trust in the system is going to go from 60%, where it is right now, to about 2%. So please explain to me how RCV is going to actually work, the nuts and bolts of it. And how are you going to audit it to be sure it's working? Thank you.
So it's commonly pointed out that Alaska has a much more centralized system than Idaho, so therefore what they were able to do in Alaska can't possibly apply to Idaho. Idaho has 44 separate counties that run their election system differently. Well, I've got really good news for you. There's another state that has implemented ranked choice voting very smoothly, where they have a decentralized system, the state of Maine. They've done it, and they have years of experience doing it. And there's administrative hurdles around the way, just like there is whenever any significant reform is passed any time in American history. There's significant administrative hurdles to implement the reform, but they've done it. And how have they done it? And it points to the direction of exactly how it could be done in Idaho. They still use you still use paper ballots. You can scan all the paper ballots. You can get cast vote records for all those ballots. And then, yes, there has to be some centralization for the counting process. So everyone here, as you're deciding how to vote on Proposition 1, if the idea that some data has to be centralized in one location in Idaho to tell you the result of a statewide election or a multi-county election, if that's a deal breaker for you, don't vote for Proposition 1. And that's okay. But here's the thing. There's nothing to be worried about that process, because the actual tabulation of ballots will never be connected to the internet. It is illegal to connect vote tabulation equipment to the internet, and that won't change. All that will happen is highly secure data transfers. And they can be done without using, those data transfers from one place to another can be done without the internet. It just takes more time, right? So you can hire highly secure courier services to do it. That's how they've sometimes done it in Maine, but it takes more time.
We're over time there.
So that's the basic
Wrap
answer
that
to your
up.
question. We've got, and if anyone wants a lot of details on that, I've got some great
There's a lot more
handouts of how
questions.
this has been done.
Keep that moving. He's going to answer it.
So I think the key is that part of our goal is that we want to trust our government. And right now, Americans and Idahoans have a very low trust, particularly in the federal government. And a lot of Idahoans have a low trust in several aspects of our state government. I don't think anything about Prop 1 is designed to increase our trust in government. Right now, Idahoans will tell you, regardless of political party, that the government they feel is most responsive to them and that they trust the most because they have the most input is your local government, your county government. And right now, that's where elections happen, is at your county government. And if you have a problem, I can go down to Mike Rosedale. And this is the beauty of our current system in Idaho. We're a small state, and you can get to know everybody in local government if you take the time and operate in good faith, and they will respond to you. We've seen that in Bonner County here, where we get to give input at our county commission, with our assessor, with our treasurer, with our clerk. And a lot of that goes away. The further it gets away from home, the less we are going to trust it. The further it's influenced by out-of-state millions of dollars, the less we're going to trust it. What I find interesting is we're going to apply ranked choice voting to all the local elections, but not the President of the United States of America. That is very telling, that we're comfortable with the system that we have in place, that we have 9 choices on Tuesday for President of the USA. And I'm willing, and when we talk about we want to get a plurality of people behind a candidate, I'm pretty confident that Donald Trump is going to get 75 to 80% of the vote here in Idaho. That, we've been advocating tonight, Luke's been advocating for 45% as an acceptable standard. And I love that right now we have a system that works, that's local, and that we can attain a much higher plurality of results and that Idahoans can trust.
All right, we have a question over here, and then we're getting a little bit long in the evening, so we'll do a question over here, one more over there, and then
just real
if you
quick,
guys want to do closing comments, we
If
can
I
do
could just respond real quick
Go
to
ahead.
the last one. Mr. Chairman, we've actually never met. We've certainly exchanged a few ideas back and forth, but we've never met. And that was a little bit of a sugar sandwich for veterans, that we could go ahead and bypass the primary and just not worry our pretty little heads about it, and we could vote in the general election. And I guess what I would tell you from independent veterans, active duty service people, we're not willing to be the collateral damage so that you can peak the party influence that Michael keeps talking about.
Would the against side like to make a comment, just to keep it even? That's fine. Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. So we've heard a lot of discussion on open primaries. I'm really glad it's kind of segued into the part that's my concern, more than open primaries. Again, interesting how they sandwiched it together. The gentleman brought that up. I feel like it would have been a lot more successful if they were separated, but it sounds like that wasn't an option. So what I love about Idaho, one of the many, many things, is the security of our elections here. We don't have that in every state. I love you have to have ID, you have to prove all this. I feel very good and secure on my votes. So as I said, we've kind of segued into the interesting part. Because of ranked choice voting, that can't be audited, can't be hand counted, it has to go through a machine. And I personally don't feel very comfortable on what we were just told being pacified. Maybe it was a certified courier that could get it there. I really feel good about having my votes local. Keep it local, my local clerk. So I have a hard time with that. Everybody just says, oh, we got to get these open primaries, so we're fine giving away our election integrity. So I guess my question to the proponents is, again, how are we supposed to swallow losing the security of our local county counting of our votes in elections? And number two, it was touched on for about a half a second. How are we paying for this? $25 to $40 million in the state. I mean, you can go and look at Maine, you can go look at Alaska and find the numbers. But if we're talking, okay, it's only $25 million, who's paying for that? I don't know about you all, but our property taxes are high. My house is valued for more than it's worth because the market has gone down and they use the previous year's value. So I don't know about anybody else, but we got a lot of kids at home. We work our butts off and we're struggling. And the thought of having to have the taxes raised, kind of, everybody's okay with that, or nobody wants to answer. To the proponents, who's going to pay for this? Thank you.
I'll tell you, I've spoken at probably about 25 different town halls all across the state just in the past 3 weeks. And every single time we talk in detail about the cost. So we're happy to talk about the cost. The Secretary of State put out a letter a couple months ago estimating that it could be $25 to $40 million in one-time costs. So it's very misleading, some of what's going on around out there saying that it will be year to year, $40 million. Not true. He estimated one-time cost. And he said clearly that it would only be that higher amount if all of the vote tabulation equipment in Idaho had to be replaced. Now, in the time since the Secretary of State put out that analysis, we have had alternative analyses, and you can distrust them if you want to, but we have an alternative analyses from experts around the country, including a former county clerk in Utah who oversaw the implementation of ranked choice voting in his county. And he found that actually Idaho's current vote tabulation equipment can work for implementing ranked choice voting with just minor upgrades of software that could bring the cost down much closer to what we've seen around the country, where typically ranked choice voting costs somewhere between 50 cents and $1.50 per voter to implement. So in Maine, that was about $500,000 for the whole state, which was about 50 cents per voter. Now I have that entire analysis. If any of you want a copy of it, I can give it to you afterwards. You can distrust it, and that's fine, and that's part of the debate in the next 5 days in determining how you're gonna vote. If you believe
10 seconds.
that the cost is too much and it's not worth it for securing the voice of every Idaho voter to actually be able to have a real say in our elections, that's up to you. And you'll vote no. But do the homework. Look at both sides of that debate.
So our Secretary of State is tasked with the constitutional responsibility of securing our elections. And he's been very responsible in the budgets that he has submitted in the estimates of the system. Now, I remember in 2018, when we addressed Medicaid expansion, that we were told by Mr. Mayville and Reclaim Idaho that it was only going to cost less than $100 million. And this year, the state of Idaho is going to pay $1 billion for Medicaid expansion. So we don't exactly have a great track record coming from the supporters of Prop 1 as to what the costs are going to be. I personally trust the Secretary of State. I can tell you that as a member of the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee, Idaho is going to be very responsible with the taxpayer money, and if we have to implement a ranked choice voting system, it will cost Idaho a lot of money. That will come down to the county level, because right now the county has to bear the costs, many of the costs of the elections, and this will add to their complications, and it will raise your property taxes at the local level. And the founders threw off the British government for a much lower tax structure, and we're asking to add more cost to government on top of the 55% growth in state spending that we've seen just in the last 4 years. And so that's yet another reason that I'm voting no on Proposition 1.
I'll just take the remaining 30 seconds, and having done talks like Luke and going around to different counties, I have talked to several county commissioners, and they are absolutely gobsmacked. They do not know how the county will pay for it. They're barely making it. In Kootenai County, we have a school levy and we have a fire district levy, and the reason is the county doesn't have any money. And so we asked the question, if an additional burden is going to go on Kootenai County, where Christy and I live, how is the county going to make ends meet? We don't know.
All right, we have one more question here, and then we will, if you guys want to take a minute each to do a closing comment, and then we will conclude the evening. But here's the final question.
Are there any provisions for equal media access for all the different candidates and campaign spending limits? Because if there's 40 candidates, to be fair, I would think they should all have equal media access. They should be spending the same amount of money. Because right now it just seems like whoever gets the most money from Vanguard, BlackRock will just win. So is there any provision for that?
There currently is not. There was a ballot initiative that passed in the 70s, which is the reason why we have the sunshine laws, and we all can look at everyone's sunshine reports and know what's being spent. The ballot initiative process does not have spending limits or donor limits for what an individual donor can contribute. And that's something that I would be personally, I would be very supportive of some kind of campaign finance regulation. And who knows, maybe after November 5th, we could get together and agree on something. There's certainly been, we've talked a lot about the funds that have been raised in support of Proposition 1. There has been, it's not as much, but there's been a lot of funds raised by large donors on the other side of this issue as well. And I believe they would have raised a lot more if they could. There's been a very energetic effort to raise as much money as possible on both sides.
I think it goes back to the evidence of open primaries and RCV. And again, we've heard the argument several times from the proponents. It's going to hold the politicians more accountable to the people. And what you might find is during a campaign and an election, you will find that the candidates will adjust their rhetoric to more reflect the broad base of the people. But again, my point remains, when you actually look at governance, you do not see any tangible difference in how the politicians represent the people. And so it begs the question, basically from the questioner here, where's the influence going to be coming from? Who are those politicians going to represent? And by blasting open the primaries and implementing RCV, it makes it more likely for a politician to need to seek bigger money to differentiate themselves from a field of up to 48 candidates, or 22, or 20, or even 15, by the way. The same problem remains. And that's my biggest concern up here tonight, is watching that big money come into Proposition 1, watching how politicians respond to money. That's pragmatic, it's the reality, and it's sad, and we all know it from DC and even into our states sometimes, and even local jurisdictions. That problem is not going to go away. It's going to be exacerbated with Proposition 1.
I do want to thank all the panelists for coming tonight, and I do want to thank everybody that's here. So, yes, a round of applause. Sometimes these things do go long, but this is important that the questions get asked and they have the opportunity to be answered. So if this seemed long, go to one of those BCRCC meetings or go to a county commissioner meeting or something like that. It is a very long, it is not for the faint of heart. Old timers used to talk about fortitude. This is the fortitude of politics, is to be in this, to hear it, to hear people talk about the things that they are concerned about. And I am thankful to all of you guys for coming out to do this, because this just wasn't happening, and you guys all agreed, so I commend you. And I guess some final note, if anybody would like to say something, or do you feel that you've said everything? Never say enough. That means you're first. So Christy Wood is going to speak to us for just, let's do it 1 minute, because we got to get these people out of here.
Absolutely. Well, my friend Gray, Vietnam veteran Gray, he wanted to speak earlier, and he didn't get a chance to, so I want to speak for Gray. This is his statement. I'm an Army veteran. 80,000 veterans in Idaho are unaffiliated with a political party. They're independents. They cannot vote in our closed primaries unless they declare a party. I'm an example. I have voted for members of almost all political parties and independents. In Idaho, I must declare a political party if I want to vote in the primary. I chose the Republican Party. I'm an independent. I should be able to vote for whoever is running for a specific office regardless of party. It should be my right to vote for a Republican who's running for governor, an independent running for state senator, and a Democrat for state representative. Open primaries allow that. I could vote for the person and how he or she addresses issues, not the party or the party line. Now, what I hear from all of my veterans friends is they served their country. They did not serve a party. I hope you'll support open choice.
Let's keep the comments. Do it at the ballot. Let these people speak their mind about this.
Well, we talked a lot about why we designed a top 4 open primary with ranked choice voting in the general election. So much of the thought that went into the design of this had to do with just a basic idea, which I've been repeating in different ways all night. Government should be accountable to a larger number of voters rather than a smaller number. Don't we all agree with that? And we might disagree with exactly how you accomplish that. But government, if you can design an election system in the best way possible, you'd want one where government ends up being accountable to a larger number of voters rather than a smaller number. And by the way, when we talk about the influence of big money, it is easier for large financial interests to have an influence over a small number of voters than it is over a big number of voters. And that's fundamentally what this reform is about. It opens up the primary so that everyone can participate, and it makes the general election truly competitive by having 4 candidates on the ballot with genuine competition so that every vote matters, every citizen matters in our democracy.
If I don't take 80 seconds, I'm giving my 20 to him.
Go for it. Go for the 80. Let's do it.
It comes back to the 2 initial questions that I'd asked at the beginning of the panel, and that is, looking at the landscape of federal institutions, there's a crisis of trust and confidence, and it's not good for the republic. This is not a sign of a healthy republic. I think we can all agree on that. And the one shining jewel we have in Idaho, that's the exception to that rule, is our election system here. 2/3 of Idaho, and I wish it were 100%, but 2/3 of Idahoans believe in the integrity of Idaho's elections. So after you heard all of us talk about the intricacies and the complexities of ranked choice voting and open primaries, we have to come back to that question. Does this enhance or does it damage the trust in our valued institution, our election system here in Idaho? I would argue without hesitation, it's going to damage the trust, and I can tell you that as we look at jurisdictions that have tried, especially ranked choice voting across the country, and you look at post-voter surveys after those elections, trust is lower, even for those municipalities that kept ranked choice voting. Trust goes down, and that's my biggest concern for the state of Idaho. We need to protect the trust of our election system.
Okay, I note that the Communist Party of the United States of America has ranked choice voting as a part of their party platform. So that is interesting. The key for Idaho is that right now, if veterans want 10 candidates on the ballot for the Idaho State Senate seat in District 1, that can happen in the current system. You could have 10 competitive political parties or 5 independents and 10 political parties. You could have 20 people on the ballot today and get choice. The key to the government reflecting the people is our involvement in the system on a daily basis, getting to know your government representatives. It's not Prop 1 is not the answer to that. Prop 1 gives more access to moneyed interest from out of the state. It does not give more control to Idahoans. And I want us to all be involved in the very well-functioning system we have today, voting against Proposition 1.
Once again, thank you everyone for coming tonight. So everybody's going to be going out from here. The roads could be icy. I want to say a quick prayer just for safety. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and thank you for this time that we've spent, Lord, doing the hard business of politicking and running a country. And Lord, as everyone here goes out, just give them safety as they go home and bless them as they go to the ballot box, that they would make the choice that is in line with their conscience and in line with what they've heard tonight and what has compelled them, what is the right thing to do. So we pray for all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Good night, everybody, and thank you for coming out.